Thank you. It's lovely to be here and see all your faces. This is a picture of NASA's Cassini. Who's heard of NASA's Cassini? Well, we got a few space nerds in here. I like it. So Cassini came back to Earth last year, 2017. It left Earth in 1997. It got us the clearest picture of Saturn we've ever had before, collected incredible amounts of data, and advanced science in a wide range of fields and academic publications and leading venues. And so when I saw this, I was, first of all, just sort of, I got a little bit emotional. I was like blown away by how far we've come in terms of science and technology, that we actually sent this probe to Saturn all the way, like, very close, and, like, brought it back, and it, like, mission successful. Unbelievable, right? The other thing that happened was I thought about that time span, 1997 to 2017, and the world that Cassini left in 1997 and the world it came back to in 2017 and how it's changed, specifically in the realm of technology, which I'm sure many of you are deeply interested in. So 1997 was the year Google.com was registered as a domain name. Since then, we've seen a massive reinvention in our social technologies, in our communication technologies, the way we consume news, productivity technologies, project management, as well as, of course, the mobile revolution that we all have our phones in our pockets that can connect to these technologies, and social media in terms of the way we connect with each other. Technology has really become a very, very intimate part of our lives. We spend an incredible amount of time with it. And somehow our lived experience, it seems to influence our relationships, our families, our friendships, as well as our identity, our worldview, our politics, our health and well-being. There's a lot of sort of anecdotal or personal experiences that align with some of these things, but we don't yet have a very clear understanding of exactly what's happening here and how we're being affected. So today what I want to talk about is three main ideas. First of all, I want to discuss the unintended consequences of technology. Sure, we have incredible benefits of what we're able to do, but we're also seeing other impacts that are important to address. Next, I want to discuss specifically as technologists how we need to consider the broader impact on society and individuals of the work we do and how we might go about doing that specifically from the lens of design, because that's my background. And then finally, I'm going to end by talking a little bit why mindfulness, this sort of new revolution of mindfulness and meditation in a secular sense based on science, why that has a very important role to play both for individuals but also for designers and technologists. So this graph shows the number of monthly users on various social media. And you can see there's Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, etc. And the number at the top of each bar shows you how many people are using that service per month. So the big here, Facebook has 2 billion different people looking at it per month, right? So these corporations, tech companies, are influencing our lives on the level of governments at least, if not in many, many more ways and much deeper ways. But the accountability and the incentives of tech companies aren't the same as governments. Tech companies are very profit motivated, whereas governments have certain regulations and certain approaches involving transparency and accountability. So here's an example of an unintended consequence of technology. This is a study done by the Wall Street Journal in their publication called Red Feed, Blue Feed. And basically they created two Facebook profiles, a very liberal Facebook profile and a very conservative profile, as those words are defined in the United States. When you actually look at those feeds and you look at any sort of news issue from the red feed or from the blue feed, you see that liberal people and conservative people are shown completely different takes on the same issue. So what does this actually mean? In some ways, it disrupts our democracy in some fundamental ways. It creates an echo chamber where we look at these feeds and we see mostly stories that we agree with. And that allows us to reinforce our own worldviews and collect more extreme positions. The concept of democracy basically hinges on foundational bed of facts, that we all sort of agree on what's happening, now let's discuss what to do about it. But as these facts start to distort online, there are some serious consequences. And this is especially relevant because 44% of people in the US claim to get their news from Facebook, and 20% cite it as their main source of news. So it really does shape the worldview of a healthy portion of the population. So this effect is known as the filter bubble, and it also applies to Google search results and some other technologies. So this makes me kind of think of HAL 9000. And I'll tell you why. So who knows who HAL 9000 is? I have to ask. Oh, great. This is awesome. So if for those of you who don't, HAL 9000 is from a brilliant book and movie, 2001: Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. And basically, it is the sentient artificial intelligence on a spaceship. And over the course of the movie, as you might expect, it starts to antagonize humanity and, in fact, actually commits murder of some of the crew members. And there's some really chilling scenes of HAL 9000 with its dispassionate, robotic voice saying some very scary things. So there's lots of science fiction like this with dystopic artificial intelligence and robot wars and all this kind of stuff. But the reason I think about HAL 9000 when I think about the modern internet is we still are talking a lot about this potential dystopian future of AI, but actually there are machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence algorithms in our pockets right now that are influencing the way we think and feel in some pretty important ways. And look, sure, they're not sentient, but we did create them. The issue is that we created them with fairly simple incentives. Those big corporations are interested in profit, and so they're interested in the amount of time you spend on their websites, the amount of things you click on. And so when we create these extremely powerful artificial intelligence with very, very simple incentives, we start to see some of these unintended consequences. So yeah, the dystopian future is something we can worry about. We should also be thinking about artificial intelligence today. As human-computer interaction specialists, computer science engineers, user experience designers, we know firsthand that the decisions we make and the designs we bring out into the world very much shape the world, and we also shape the thoughts and feelings of our users. So how do we manage unintended consequences when we're looking at this kind of scale? To me, the next wave of human-centered design, and I would say technology as a whole, is to embrace the importance of values. In my own design practice for the past 10 years working in industry, academia, HCI, UX, all that sort of stuff, I've been working to find this harmony, and it's ended up with me focusing a lot on mental health, mindfulness, and well-being. And the statistics that I've found throughout my work are pretty staggering, and they're extremely relevant to anyone who works with technology. The Mental Health Commission of Canada cites 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health problem or illness. There's a huge stigma around mental health in terms of learning that a family member or friend has a mental health issue. So half of those who report having a depression or anxious experience actually never see a doctor about it, even though they claim to have had that experience. Depression costs the economy $32.3 billion a year. Anxiety costs the economy $17.3 billion a year. So those two conditions alone are costing us $50 billion a year here in Canada. As technologists, we tend to focus on interfaces, the latest research methods in design, data, code, algorithms. But we need to remember that the manifestation of our work in society could be impacting people's mental health. It's certainly impacting their thoughts and feelings, and we have some open questions about the link. There's a researcher named Jean Twenge, and she's also the author of a book called iGeneration, looking at today's teens and adolescents. And there's a lot of research on the changes in the behavior and the psychology of today's teenagers. In 2011, 2012, there was a huge spike in young people owning phones and spending time on social media. At the same time, in the same population, we see sharp decreases in dating, sexual activity, driving, working, doing homework, drinking alcohol, sleeping, getting together with friends. We've known for decades that face-to-face social interaction is very, very good for mental health. So just that last one, getting together with friends, is pretty concerning. There's also been a spike in loneliness with the same population, same time, a spike in loneliness, a spike in feelings of left out, and clinical spikes in measures related to anxiety, symptoms related to depression, and suicide. These measures have been fairly consistent for decades, and in 2011 and 2012, we are seeing a sudden spike and change. We cannot be certain, we cannot draw causation that technology is the culprit yet. But there is a strong correlation, and as technologists, it's our responsibility to start thinking about this. There's also some emerging research starting to show causation. So for example, researchers studying Facebook have associated use of the news feed to symptoms of depression. And they've also shown that the more time you spend on the news feed, the more these symptoms present themselves. Also, they propose a mechanism based on some clever research, which I won't get into, of how this is happening. And the mechanism is social comparison. So the idea being, we're looking at this news feed, and we tend to see the highlights of all our friends' lives. And this is true of most social media. You're seeing someone get married, someone on vacation, someone hanging out at a party, and I'm sitting there in my boxers with a bag of chips, like, what am I doing with my life, right? There's a couple of other studies that are really relevant too. There's a Monitoring the Future survey that looks at people in 8th grade, 10th grade, 12th grade, and shows that the screen time in these populations directly correlates to self-reported unhappiness. So we're starting to see mental health and well-being may be an unintended casualty of today's technology in some ways. The data is young, but there's definitely enough for us to be thinking about it and formulating new hypotheses targeting the unintended consequences of today's technology. Now we have to get a little nerdy here and think, how exactly is technology influencing the mind so deeply? So here's Herb Simon predicting it nicely in 1969, so almost 50 years ago. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources. When there's so much information out there, filtering and search engines become extremely relevant. So if you think about social media, news, Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, you think about how these systems work. Some of their really genius insights and algorithms are filtering algorithms, curation algorithms, and newsworthy, like put the right thing on the front page, right? Reddit, for example, uses a social mechanism to bring really interesting stuff to the front page. So we have such an overabundance of information, the battleground is about filtration. And as Herb Simon points out, the battleground is also about attention. Harvard did a study that showed that 47% of the time we spend during the day, we spend with our mind wandering away from what we are actually doing, using a really clever mechanism called experience sampling. They also showed that when your mind is wandering, you're more likely to report unhappiness. This is adults, not children. So when you think about this overabundance of information, and you think about our desire to filter that information, you create an environment where there's an excessive competition for our attention. As a UX designer, UI designer, HCI, almost all the work I've done has been about filtering attention. I basically go build a user interface to choreograph the attention, and I use that word like a dance, right? Like to choreograph the attention of the user. First, capture the attention, working with the marketing team, and then choreograph how it goes to this button and to this button and how it scrolls down the feed. And ideally, it stays on that feed for very long, so we see lots of advertising. So we're in a situation where big technology companies are aggressively competing for our attention, which is a faculty of mind. This is the missing link between how technology relates to mental health. Take a look at this picture of the Gardner Expressway, something we've probably all been stuck in traffic in at some point, right? And I want you to consider critically, like take away everything you already know, and consider critically why Liberté Yogurt has paid so much money to put their name on that billboard, right? You've got a technology there. It's a billboard, it's a scaffolding, and a big platform, right? But if we built that in the forest, it wouldn't cost very much to put an ad on it, right? Why is it so expensive? Well, it's expensive because hundreds of thousands of people are driving down this highway every day. Liberté is not buying billboard real estate. They're buying the attention of the drivers on the highway, right? Attention has become a commodity to be bought and sold like any other commodity. But if attention is a commodity, who does it belong to? Does it belong to the owner of the billboard? Does it belong to Liberté? Or does it belong to the driver, right? In this example, I can reasonably choose to ignore this billboard. Even that is kind of arguable if you really understand branding, but I can reasonably choose to say, whatever, I don't care about yogurt, right? But as our attention becomes a commodity, people are getting very, very good at mining that commodity. Attention is a commodity, that means attention is worth money. So you guys may have heard this investigation into Facebook ads being used to influence politics, like Brexit and the US election. This ad is scary. Basically, the intention is to understand a political divide around religion and morality and wedge it, to create an ad, target people, and wedge that divide to create a divide. It's a very, very new form of foreign influence in politics. You know, someone could call it propaganda or espionage or some of these words we don't necessarily associate with ourselves as technologists, but clearly we should. These massive organizations are using sophisticated technology like Facebook to create intentionally irresistible media. It seemed like a good deal. We get to connect with our friends. All they do is show us a few ads. Everybody wins. But the designers in the room and the HCI specialists in the room know about the frameworks that we have to nudge behavior and maximize time on site. We can use user interface, we can use technology to influence the way people behave, the things they choose to do, and the way they think. These services, in order to maximize the bottom line, have made it very, very easy to advertise. Who's ever put a Facebook ad up for something they're working on? Not a lot. So when you actually go do it, it's an incredibly easy user experience and it's completely automated. But the scary part is you can target very specifically. Using all of our personal information, you can decide who is going to see that ad very, very carefully. Now, unfortunately, to make this really effective, the tools are automated and there's no oversight. And so here's another unintended consequence. No one is checking who's putting those ads. You can target very, very specifically. And so some, arguably moral, arguably brilliant people have figured out how to very specifically target those who would be triggered by this ad and wedge the divide in American politics, similar with Brexit in Great Britain. I know all the theory can get kind of open, so I thought I'd bring a piece of art here. This is Banksy. I love this piece because on the left there, you can see the shape and the color of his piece evokes a very famous brand, though it's never mentioned. And I love it because it shows us just how much we have been programmed by these efforts. We all know what brand that is, despite the fact that there's no word of it on the screen at all. And so he, in that shape, talks a little bit about this issue from a more emotional point of view. They make flippant comments from buses that imply you're not sexy enough and that all the fun is happening somewhere else. They are on TV making your girlfriend feel inadequate. They have access to the most sophisticated technology the world has ever seen, and they bully you with it. So emotional, not necessarily academic, but interesting nonetheless. When they talk about sophisticated technology, that's real, right? Data scientists, some of the best data scientists in the world are working for these companies, mining personal data to interpret our lives from limited data set and target advertising to us. Engineers are looking at ways to use sensor data to contribute new relevant personal data to fuel this process. Psychologists, neuroscientists, marketers are studying our biological urges and our emotional triggers to catch our attention in ways we simply cannot resist. HCI specialists and designers are using persuasive technology for behavior change and to influence emotional design, as well as influence thoughts. Despite the incredible value that we have received from technology, from NASA's Cassini all the way to the smartphones in our pockets, we have to wonder about these unintentional consequences. I don't have answers for you, but there are questions. Is it worth it? Are we safer? Are we healthier? Are we happier? Are our human rights being respected? We're starting to see a backlash. Movements are cropping up to resist what is called the attention economy. This is Tristan Harris, who created a movement called Time Well Spent. He's been receiving major press coverage, political consultations with world leaders and tech leadership around the world to discuss this issue that I've been talking about, the attention economy, the commodification of the faculty of mind known as attention, and the use of that to make money. Regulators are deeply concerned about Facebook and Brexit and Facebook and Trump. And also, if people are interested in the blockchain, when you get beside all the Bitcoin hype and ways to make money, you realize a lot of the interest in the blockchain is about how to create more open protocols for the internet. So we have open protocols like HTTP and TCP, but things like our social media, getting from point A to point B, like Uber and Lyft, these are all closed, privatized protocols. So one of the big promises of the blockchain is if we were to make open protocols for social, open protocols for transit, what would the internet look like? I think of it personally as attention activism. Everyone has a role to play Big tech companies have to take responsibility. Governments have to think about regulation. Education has to think about the next generation. Healthcare has to think about treating the afflictions of obsessive use of technology. Science has a huge burden to actually inform this by understanding what's really, really happening. I think of previous generations and drunk driving and smoking, and I think about how my parents' generation and the generation before them think about these things and how I think about them so differently. Among my peers, the idea that anyone would drive drunk is crazy. And I remember even in high school, even the sort of like tough, cool person would never drink and drive because we have just been campaigned and so clearly educated on the issue. And you think about smoking and you think about the scientific studies about the health effects and you think about the regulation like the labels on the package and the age restriction, but you also think about the culture is that as individuals in social circles, we start to say, that's not that cool. It's not that cool to have a smoke. And we start to see these things come together and form a form of activism against smoking. And so I think that the next 10, 20 years is going to be more and more important for all of you and me and people who work in technology to think about the faculty of attention and mental health and activism from wherever we're sitting. We all need to work together to identify these issues, understand them, and address them. It's not just our design work, though. There's technologies, there's governments, there's companies, and I don't want you to walk away from here thinking, wow, these big giants are just messing with us and we're helpless, right? This is how Tim Wu ends his book called The Attention Merchants, which covers the history of this. Great read. Highly recommend it. If we desire a future that avoids the enslavement of the propaganda state, as well as the narcosis of the consumer and celebrity culture, we must first acknowledge the preciousness of our attention and resolve not to part with it as cheaply or unthinkingly as we so often have. I love this quote because at the end of a detailed explanation of advertisers and tech companies and media companies, he ends with this notion of individual responsibility, that we all have a role to play in this, because after all, the battleground of attention lies within our minds, and we have some control of our minds. And so if we choose differently, we may be able to have an impact on this in our day-to-day lives as well. And that's why I believe mindfulness is very, very relevant to attention activism. So who's heard of mindfulness before? Who's practiced mindfulness before? Great. So those of you who've practiced and heard of it may know that the whole process of mindfulness is all about training your attention. There's many, many different definitions, but attention is always a big part of it. And so I believe it's an individual way that we can combat the attention economy. And we're starting to see a global movement that agrees with me. On the top left there, you see Jon Kabat-Zinn, who was the first one to introduce mindfulness to healthcare in a very serious way. And he's leading world leaders at the World Economic Forum through a mindfulness practice in the morning. In the top right, you can see the Mindful Nation UK report. The parliamentarians of the UK government have practiced mindfulness together. Based on this report, they're looking at how to bring mindfulness into the school system, into the healthcare system. Incredible advances at the political level. In the bottom left, kind of representing all the programs around the world that are bringing mindfulness to the school system. And actually, the bottom right is around the corner, the Peel Region Police Force practicing mindfulness together. Time sums it up as the mindful revolution. Very, very interesting, and I think very relevant to the fact that these technologies are influencing that faculty of attention. And we're shedding light on this through science. It may seem mysterious, what is this practice? But this is a graph of academic publications about mindfulness over the past 2 to 3 decades. So you can see in the past few decades an exponential increase in the scientific discussion of this. I could do a whole other talk on the science here, but I want to just keep on the high-level points here, which is that there are secular, non-religious definitions of mindfulness that are emerging that are driven by science. And basically what it is paying attention without judging. It's an effort to see things clearly using your senses. It's a practice. It's something you train and you improve at as you go, as you practice more and more. I'm a practitioner myself. That's me at the Isle of Skye, practicing meditation in Scotland. And I have a scientific worldview, if you hadn't noticed. And so I think it's important to say there's also a very strong value alignment between science and mindfulness. Basically, we use science to investigate without any variables. We try to take a specific phenomena and investigate it. What mindfulness really is taking that similar mentality and stance to our first-person subjective conscious experience. I don't really have an instrument yet, and if I did, it would be great. But I don't really have a great instrument to understand like what it is that I am experiencing right now, what you're experiencing, what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're hearing in the environment around us. And so when someone goes off on retreat or when they practice mindfulness in the morning, they're practicing bringing attention to that. So we can even do like a very micro dose of mindfulness right now, where I can bring your attention to what you're seeing vividly. You can see a picture in front of you. You can see it. You can see colors. You can see me. You can see a slide. And if I draw your attention to say, try to find something in your visual field that you haven't noticed yet, right? There's a big complex visual field. What's something you haven't looked at yet? And then take a look at it and try to see it with clarity as to what it is. You can see color. You can see shape. And we can also reflect on the fact that we didn't notice it. And this is just a very simple illustration of what someone is doing, what I'm doing sitting there. I can go to Scotland and be on my phone and whatever, but I can go at the end of this hike and sit on this rock and be like, what does it really sound like here? What does it really look like here? What does it feel like on my body? And reconnecting with that experience in the moment. And the reason why I attach it to the scientific method is the same way that we do these experiments and we draw conclusions. I often come back from a situation like this and draw insights like, oh, my mind tends to wander a lot about work. I think work is really stressing me out. Things like that. Now, I'm very sensitive to the sensationalization of this and the sensationalization of science. So I want to illustrate just a couple of the aggregate findings, something we've seen reproduced in science. So first of all, mindfulness has been associated with the improvement of attentional subsystems in the mind. So we actually have some evidence that attention is being affected. We also see reduced activity in brain regions associated with daydreaming and mind wandering, thinking about the past, thinking about the future. We also see if you do repetition, so you do intensive practice or daily practice, the more you do, the stronger these effects become. And perhaps the most important for our discussion today is in a meta-review of all kinds of studies about this. There are lots of different claims about what meditation mindfulness can do, and I caution you to be very judicious. But when you look at the actual aggregate knowledge, there are 3 things that are clearly showing up in the data. It's still early days, but we're getting some really strong signs that anxiety is improved, depression is improved, and it changes our relationship to pain. And that's very interesting because our inner narrative, the thing that about our mind wandering and daydreaming, is very, very related to the subjective experience of both anxiety and depression. But even more interesting for technologists is that mindfulness works through attention mechanisms to improve mental health. So there's this association between attention and mental health. And whereas mindfulness is making an opportunity to train attention and thus improve these metrics of mental health, our modern technology seems to be fragmenting our attention, allowing it to wander, and we're starting to see evidence that that's having negative impacts on our mental health. So the big question I come to you with is whether popular culture, media, and science's interest in mindfulness, is it a coincidence or is it a direct response to the attention economy? I don't have an answer to this. The science is young, but we're starting to see this complementarity. Tech influences attention, and that impacts mental health negatively. Mindfulness influences attention and impacts mental health positively. So there's a lot we can discuss here in the Q&A. We'll get to that soon. But let's bring that back home to design and technology. As designers, we need to broaden our perspective. I'm going to have a drink here. User experience work is all about empathizing with individuals. As HCI and UX people, we use psychology and anthropology to understand people and use that to make our technology better. I've been in this field for a while, and it's true that the focus often becomes 100% about retention, return on investment, how much time people spend on screen, how much they click, etc. The methods of psychology and anthropology were designed to study culture and designed to study the mind. In some way, we are exploiting them in the industry of technology, specifically for profit. And that's fine because we definitely do want to grow organizations, and this is how our society works. But at the same time, why are we separating all the analysis tools that anthropology and psychology give us about understanding the mind and culture from the process? I find something to be lost in the concept of user experience or user-centered design. This way of studying the individual to make the technology better for the organization. And that's why I prefer the term human-centered design, which I'm sure you've heard, but the reason why I prefer it is that human gives us this holistic picture and allows us to bring values back into the equation. It captures a holistic picture of who we're designing for, not just a user, someone who's going to use our technology and then otherwise we don't care, or a consumer, someone who's going to buy our technology and then otherwise we don't care. Sure, we need to solve business problems, but as tech starts to deeply influence our minds, we need to add new values into our design process. And we can use tech to counter these unintended consequences. So here's Google experimenting with, if you look really closely, you'll see the top story here is being fact-checked in real time, right? So Google notices the filter bubble problem, where their algorithms are only showing you what you agree with. And then they bring a new value into their work, not just about how many clicks and whether you click on the top story, but we bring the value of accuracy and we say, let's add some fact-checking and bring the intention to prevent that unintended consequence. A beautiful example because it also shows we don't have to antagonize these companies. These are unintended consequences. In fact, the people at these companies are the ones who are thinking the most about some of these problems, and we need to help them. Here's another example of a startup, I think they're in New York, called TalkLife. And so TalkLife uses the architecture of social media, but unlike other networks, it promotes mental health. So it uses similar mechanisms. You know how Facebook has the like button and the little reactions? Well, they have hug and support. And the entire premise of the platform is to share your intimate secrets about challenges you're going through around mental health. And I'm happy to say that a lot of their target audience are in that same teen and adolescent demographic. They bring the value of mental health and compassion to that same technology of social media. This is something I just found last week. It's called Kialo, and it addresses the filter bubble by presenting both sides to an issue. So you can see here where we have problems on the modern internet where issues are just becoming one-sided. Kialo's user interface makes a really strong effort to present both sides. So I picked a challenging example. Someone raised, should Donald Trump should be impeached. Pro and con represents whether people agree or disagree with that. Wherever you might land on this issue, Kialo kind of encourages you to read the most voted comments that disagree with you. And hopefully, if they're doing their job right, I certainly had this experience, you fall on one side of this issue, but when you read the other side, you're like, well, you know what? There are some interesting points here that I didn't think of. And this is something that our internet is currently failing at. So Kialo brings values of democracy and debate to these same technologies that are influencing our news, our politics, and our journalism. Organizations rely heavily on people in this room, technologists, researchers, and designers. And specifically, the research and design capacity is all about understanding context. So what I'm really advocating for is a holistic approach to integrate the individual values, the organizational values and business goals, as well as our values as society together. I think some of those examples I just showed you kind of illustrate what the future of the internet could be if we do this right. And I don't think it's that kind of hippy-dippy like pipe dream, because if you look closely, the organizational missions very much align with this. Facebook's mission statement is to make the world more connected. My question is, do they measure it? Or do they incentivize their algorithm to measure whether people are feeling more connected? A lot of us in this room have skills in psychology and anthropology. We are the people who can show them how to measure these subjective elements, right? A lot of people think tech is the antagonist, like, oh, technology is the problem. That, it's stressing us out, it's causing all these problems. But as we've seen, technology isn't the problem. It's how we use that technology and what values we bring to that technology. That's what really matters. So we can bring values to existing technologies like I just showed you. We have Google with fact-checking, we have Kialo and TalkLife. But we can also create technology with completely different values. We can bring the value of mindfulness specifically as something that runs completely counter to the attention economy to create technologies. So Sonic Cradle was my first project in this space. I explored these same habit-forming frameworks, persuasive technology, to create a persuasive medium that creates an experiential introduction of mindfulness by connecting sound to your breathing and creating an interactive experience that mimics the same loop that we have when we try to practice mindfulness, except without some of the pitfalls around judgment. And there was some very promising qualitative and quantitative evidence about this being able to simulate the experience. I thought a lot about training wheels. The idea is not to improve meditation. The idea is to make the first experience of it very different and inviting, to give people an idea what it's like to ride up and down the block on a bicycle, so that when you take the training wheels off, you know what you're shooting for and you don't feel as lost. This is basically fundamental ideas around persuasive technology from Stanford, B.J. Fogg. And I'm not the only one exploring this in human-computer interaction research. You can see slow technology, the value of slowness, the value of making space for reflection. You can see the values of positive psychology and positive emotions. You can see the values of transformation in this transformative technology, And then you can see also the values of calming technology and relaxation. All of these mechanisms about understanding the mind, understanding the brain, and applying them to design technologies that are for different purposes. So after Sonic Cradle, I joined a local Toronto startup that were working on a brain sensing headband. And I helped create a mindfulness experience using this brain sensing technology that tracks your brain activity while you meditate and gives you feedback. It's not without its ethical questions, but it has introduced hundreds of thousands of people to mindfulness that otherwise might not have found it. And it's a great example of navigating the intersection of impact and integrity. Interaxon, the company that I work for that's behind Muse, is a startup. They are driven by the same incentives as any growing company. Yet at the same time, we worked very hard to balance some of these other values. And I think it's a great illustration that I'm not advocating that we change our values, that all the metrics that we're using to build our technology are broken. It's that we simply add some other metrics that we do care if people use our product because we are a capitalist organization, but we also do care if it's making them feel better or if it's addicting them or if it's helping them with their mental health. We do care. I've recently also been supporting an awesome team working on a new mindfulness app called Bright Mind that works with a very well-known mindfulness teacher named Shinzen Young. And this is just one example. I am far from the only person who's exploring mindfulness and technology. I suspect many of you have tried some of these. You can see Headspace in the corner there. There's guided meditation VR, which allows you to bring mindfulness to a VR experience. Checky and Moment on the side there are these awesome tools that track how often you use your phone. It can be a really mind-bending experience. And when I first did it, I was like, oh, interesting. I'm going to use Checky and see how many times I check my phone. Probably not too much. And then I think the first weekend, both the Saturday and Sunday, it was like 150. And I was like, oh. And I was like, I'm math-minded, so I'm like, 150. I'm like, okay, it was like 12 waking hours in the day. That's like more than 10 times an hour. And I was like, this can't be real. And just the awareness of it started to change the way I interact with my phone. So very interesting, bringing a different value to the way you use your phone. My favorite example is I grew up playing video games, and I'm a gamer. So in the bottom right corner, you see a clip of a game called Journey, which is one of the first independent games to win the Game Developers Award. And also won a Grammy, I think, for the music, which is amazing. But a lot of people associate video games with people addicted to Call of Duty, like just with their headsets on killing people. And it's a perfect example because you're kind of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater when you're like, video games are all bad. It's a very, very weird thing to say when you understand that technology is informed by our values, so that when we create technology, we can actually create it with different values. And the same thing is true with video games. Video games like Journey, video games like The Witness, video games like Senua's Sacrifice, that have values of mental health deep at their core and provide very, very different experiences that are in some ways beautiful. As the culture changes and we identify all of these unintended consequences, we will need to bring new values to technology design and our personal lives. And I believe the values of mindfulness will play a big role for a couple of reasons. Number one, as you've seen, it's a natural counterpoint to values of the attention economy, which are dominating the way we interact with technology today. Number two, it gives us a very firm language to understand, design, and evaluate technology in a new way. And number three, it's going to allow us to evolve design beyond the ROI-driven engagement and instant gratification that we frequently pursue in the technologies we create. And I want you to end with this one point. I think the attention economy is possible because attention is a limited resource, right? Any commodity market is only possible because it's a limited resource. There's only a certain number of trees, which is why we can haggle for them. If there were infinite trees, there would be no lumber commodity industry, right? So why is attention limited? Well, it's limited by the waking hours of your daily life. So as organizations are competing to capture and resell the faculty of attention that ultimately belongs to you, let's take a moment to remember that it's you who chooses what to pay attention to. And I find it interesting that it's the word pay, that we pay attention in this attention commodity market. Could anything be more precious than your waking conscious life? Mindfulness is not just about well-being anymore. It's a form of activism on an individual scale. It's a chance for us in our daily personal lives to resist the attention economy that freely trades our well-being for profit. It gives us an opportunity to reclaim the individual choice on how to spend this commodity of attention, and ultimately on how to spend our lives. Thank you. So we definitely have some time for Q&A, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on why mindfulness helps attention? I mean, is it because that we have better control or where we spend our attention, or is it because that we have less nervous about the things that we should really do?
It's a little bit of both. So when you look into the definitions of mindfulness, and let's stick to the ones by scientists, they tend to have values of attention, which is like training the faculty to pay attention, like stability of attention. If I choose to look at that green light, how long can I actually look at the green light until I get distracted? Like training that like a muscle, like getting better. But there's also the positive attitude, or sometimes it's called a non-judgmental attitude, that when I get distracted, I'm not going to have the emotional conflict that you described that feels like, oh, I'm no good at this or I'm bad at this, but being able to say, notice not only the green light, but also notice the distraction with clarity and become better at clarifying and responding to those in my daily life. Does that answer the question? Yeah, great, sure. Yeah.
I'm just curious because there's a lot in the games industry and a lot of, like you're saying, companies towards commodifying. How do you assert healthy technologies instead of pushing, say, site principles to make things more addictive? How do you go about that?
Yeah, so I think my big belief, it depends on the company because culture is everything in an organization, but my big belief is that we don't replace, we simply add. So we add new values. We are measuring how much people play. We are measuring, how much whatever. But let's measure how much they're enjoying it. Like that's an easy in. Like let's get subjective, how much they're enjoying it. But then also let's, is this affecting other things that could matter, like their sleep or their attention, stuff like that. And ultimately, depending on the company, but any company that's worth their salt, if you actually look at their mission statement, you'll find this is all there. So when you're sort of talking to your sort of leadership or the executives or whatever, I highly recommend bringing up the mission statement and being like, hey, we said that we're trying to make things more enjoyable for people. And we're noticing that people are really feeling regret when they get off their laptop at 4 a.m. And I don't know if we can really call that enjoyment, and I don't know if it's aligned with what we're trying to do as a company. And I do believe there's a win-win situation. I really want to underline these are unintended consequences. And I think, in my experience, when you sort of go upstairs on that, people are actually, if you articulate it right, people are on board with bringing some positive values. Because a lot of these tech companies are just trying to make the world a better place, and these are unintended consequences that are done without care. And I do believe that design, as I mentioned, as people who focus on anthropology and psychology and understanding people, we are in the best position to advocate for those people's well-being, and we also have the methods to do it. Yeah. Over there, yeah.
So you were saying to introduce these other incentives, right?
Yeah.
So this is kind of a two-parter.
Let's start with part one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are there a standardized set of benchmarks, or some sort of standardized metrics that I could compare one set of technology versus another one? Or
yeah, okay. So it's a good question, and I think this is why I'm a big advocate of mindfulness, right? Because I don't think there are yet. And I actually think that if you actually get into the academic work on mindfulness, you see Shauna Shapiro, who's actually speaking at a Mindful Society conference, which I'm organizing in May. If you want to come, I have some info. So she defines it as intention, attention, and attitude. Okay, so let's just take intention, for example. Intention is a huge value around social media. So you use social media a certain time, and the design is to optimize how much time you spend. But let's say, what if we design for the intention? What if Monday morning, a social media asked you, how many minutes do you want to spend on social media this week? Set an intention. I would only like to spend, 3 hours throughout the whole week. I only want to spend 3 hours on social media. And then on Sunday, it's like, hey, you actually spent 4.5 hours on social media. And then we're measuring whether the use of the product lines up with the user's intention. And I think that's an interesting example. Similarly, we could talk about attention and attitude, but you get the idea that this is why I'm so passionate about mindfulness, because it's not just about like wearing a robe and like going off to some temple. It's become a part of our society for a reason, because the scientists that are working to operationalize what this attentional practice is, in that literature, there are incredible values that we can use to answer your question. Yeah, go ahead.
So I kind of came from a similar place as you. I'm also doing research on mindfulness and urgent cases. And I think it seems to me that, so actually let me sort of rephrase maybe your point. Something like mindfulness is going to lead to more ethical design by inserting a certain kind of set of values into a design process or into sort of companies running in some way, such that you're going to counteract this commodification of attention or just profit motive in general by sort of inserting mindfulness value. Right?
I'd say balance it as opposed to counteract it. Just balance, so we have metrics on both sides.
Yeah. Well, we sort of say, well, these are causing some problems, right?
Yes.
And then we want to do something such that we're going to mitigate those problems. Right?
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there's kind of this question of, well, if you sort of add these values in, which values are going to win out and when, right? And which values are going to win out in sort of capitalist firms competing with each other, for example, right? You say, well, it's going to make us a little less money, but we're going to sort of be a little less exploitative of this commodification of attention, then they're going to lose out. And so there seems to be, to me, as somebody who's doing mindfulness research, kind of two ways in which that's insufficient. I was wondering what you think about that.
So, first of all, I don't know. That's a really good question. It's very challenging about the interaction between these systems, and I really appreciate that question. And I think the only way I can sort of start to, like, the thoughts that form in my head in response is about design. And that's, obviously because when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But as a designer, we define a lot of the direction. We kind of architect what's created. And there's a certain leeway in the field of design where we actually do creative work and like use the values and define what's created. And so I believe that it's the designer who is at the table. I've been at this table where you've got a business function, you've got a marketing function, and you've got an engineering function. The designer is the one who can represent these values, but already the designer is representing values in a way that seems to run counter to your question. So what I mean by that is, like, when I try to advocate just for UX research, often people are like, why are we spending money on UX research? Let's just build a product and start selling it. But there's this whole architecture around, well, if you design the product better, people are engaged with it and people are going to use it more and everybody wins. They're not going to hate you. And I think that we're trying to get to, and I don't know exactly how, but we're trying to get to that attention activism where there's a little bit on the tech company side, but there's also a little bit help from the government. There's a little bit of scientific studies that's informing the government and informing individuals. And then there's a little bit of individual use being like, listen, there's two social media that I use, and this one is just clearly trying to steal my attention. And this one is actually letting me set some intention. I'm going to use that one. So I have like an ecosystem. I know it's a non-answer, but there's like an ecosystem approach that I don't think, like, you're just going to be able to walk into a business and be like, forget money. Like, that's not going to happen any day soon. But I think when you look at that smoking example, you look at that drunk driving example, and when people are really hurting around mental health, I think we're going to start to be able to push society in this way. And, by all means, there are people already in government, healthcare, education, tech, research, design, technology, engineering that are thinking about this. So, yeah. Let's say if there's someone who hasn't already asked it. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question would be, I understand how you want to design or incorporate the values into the design.
Yeah.
And then you also mentioned measurements. But for me personally looking at it, measurements is something that comes after design, and then you release the design and you can receive feedback, environmental stream, or following a certain metrics. But in the concept development phase, so if we are trying to change behaviors of teenagers, and we're not trying to let them meditate because we don't know if they're interested. Mm-hmm. And in other sort of like social media or other software applications, how do we translate the ideas or into something that they're interested in, or into the design itself, rather than just promoting mindfulness or practice onto another generation? I understand that they're important, but I don't know how the values will translate.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that's it's a question about the architecture of the design process, and what you said is absolutely true. At the conceptual development phase, it's very qualitative. So you're bringing these values in qualitative ways, and you're thinking about them. But one thing you said that I do disagree with is that measurement comes after design. Like, I mean, I know it does, but I think the practice of design, when you create something, you are also creating how it should be measured. I think that's good design. I think you're creating something, and you're creating the measurement architecture, and you're creating the incentives all at the same time. And it's an iterative process. It always is. So you're not necessarily going to get it right the first time, but you're going to learn a lot. Like Muse, for example, the very first tests and UX research we did, people were like, what is this sci-fi Geordie LaForge thing I'm going to put on my head? Like, what? Why would I ever do this? And through an iterative process of both bringing the values, translating the values, collecting qualitative data, collecting quantitative data, figuring out how it was, we launched a product that made more sense. And then over time, we actually made that product better. Again, bringing both those values, both the values of the organization, the values of the individual, but also these mental health and mindfulness values to the table.
How long, do you mind just last thing a little bit how long it took though to get to that stage?
So it took me about a year to go from like hardware prototype to launched product MVP, and then we're still iterating from there. And it's been like 3 or 4 years since we launched, and we're still getting better and better and doing tons of research and improving. I think I stopped working for that company last August, but everyone is still working on the same types of stuff and trying to make things better and bring the values. And I think it's a great example of translating. One of the big user experience findings of people using Muse is just the fact that this thing is measuring your brain, and that is somehow relevant to mindfulness. Just that idea really helps people in a sort of tangible way realize, oh, this isn't like some religious spiritual thing. This is like there's some science here. There's some active training. My brain is changing. That's interesting. So you can see that sort of translation mechanism there. Yeah, right here in front. Yeah.
She kind of touched on what I wanted to ask.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, mindfulness. I'm also linguistics background, so like what you may call mindfulness is someone else's something else.
Absolutely.
But for the sake of this conversation, mindfulness to me is a privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And if we were to take ourselves out of this room,
Mm-hmm.
out of this campus, and look elsewhere, I think not that these amazing examples that you showed us don't establish that bridge,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is the point we're trying to get at. But like, like if I was to use a personal example, like I have a very stubborn sister,
Mhm.
for example, and culturally, access-wise, she may not see the value or even understand what mindfulness is to begin with.
Mhm.
And also, if we are gonna go down the route of like mindfulness, I do think there is some established morphological like sense what people get out of that word.
Mhm.
Which is like this image of like someone meditating on top of a mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I'm like saying this is not because I disagree with you. I think you had an amazing talk. It's because like I'm all about access. Like how do we make that accessible to people who might not be used to such language or to just the concept of being able to meditate. I don't disagree that it's good for health.
Mhm.
But it's just how to make it more compelling for people outside of this room, outside of this campus.
So it's a beautiful question, and the answer is really about, in my opinion, is all about how we translate through design, right? I don't necessarily think everyone needs to practice mindfulness. Like it may just not be good for people. You know, science works in the way that like it's a probabilistic curve. So there's people in those studies that weren't affected, right? So I don't necessarily think everyone needs to practice mindfulness, but these values, I think, translate through design in a way that you don't necessarily have to even say that word for something to be a mindful experience. So Journey, that game, is a very mindful experience, and Genova Chen, the designer of that game, very explicitly talks about the values he brought to that experience being about mindfulness and about, you know, playful curiosity and some of the values associated. But nowhere in that game is there anything about meditation or mindfulness. You just play it, and people are like, wow, this feels way different from most games I ever play. It's way less goal-directed. It's way more playful. And then, it won awards and got its way into the industry to become a mainstream staple. Similarly, John Kabat-Zinn, who I mentioned earlier, created a program called MBSR, which was a mindfulness program designed for hospitals. And he changed some language. He subtracted some things out. He added some elements of healthcare. and basically created a completely different program that was for people who suffer from chronic pain, depression, anxiety, psoriasis in the hospital. So I don't have the answer because it's context dependent. But whatever context you're talking about, for example, your stubborn sister, you want to be doing all of these methods of UX, HCI, whatever, to understand your audience and empathize with them and create a design that brings these values to them, if they even need those values, right? Because that could be something different for different groups as well. I want to also say that the Center for Mindfulness Studies here in Toronto that offers MBSR courses, they offer courses for people of different cultures, people of indigenous background, people with low income, and they have different teachers who are experts and social workers in these areas who change the language and translate to different people, taking the science-based secular approach to mindfulness and bringing it to different audiences in different ways. So those, to me, they're not interfaces, but they're also designs. And so I think the solution comes through the design process. Yeah. Someone who hasn't gone yet? Oh, right there, right beside you. Yeah.
It's just a comment, but before you were talking about Facebook, and I can definitely attest to feeling FOMO, feeling
Yeah.
missing out. I used to feel that a lot, when I was scrolling Facebook. But thankfully, like you were saying, we have a bit of agency over the attention that we give to things. So I've been able to figure out a way to deal with that now. So, yeah.
Great. That's great. Thank you for sharing. I mean, I personally have a lot of little rules and stuff that help me manage my attention. So one thing, my wife and I don't allow any internet in our bedroom. So it's we have to make that conscious intention, it's time to go to sleep now, and then all that stuff is gone, right? So, there are tools also digitally that allow you to measure that, but it's I think that's a great, beautiful example of choice. Of saying, you know what, I'm noticing that this is giving me FOMO, so I will choose to use it less. And I think that's a great example, so thank you. Yeah. Someone else who hasn't spoke yet. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. So when I was looking at your talk online, and I guess also when you were talking about it here, the term, design activism. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering, because this talk was very mental health, mindfulness focused. What are some other ways that design activism can relate to social issues or equity?
Yeah, so I'm not a big expert on design activism. I find that the specific area of attention activism is where I'm focused. There are some people you should definitely be reading that are not me on that. That being said, I think a lot of the way that we structure the things we create, whether they're technology or not, to stand up to certain marginal issues like income inequality or sustainability in the environment would be examples of design activism, of applying design to represent a certain activist cause. I'm sorry I can't say much more about it, but I think about technologies like Kiva, it just comes to mind for some reason, which is a microfinancing crowdsourcing platform where you're using these principles of design to help people in the sort of wealthy world create microfinance for the third world. And these types of interactions are applications of these technologies in design to create some sort of activist bridge. There's some great examples in sustainability as well. Yeah. I mean, you can argue that electric cars are a part of design activism in some sense. We're starting to see hybrids and electric cars really become more and more normal. They really weren't. They really weren't in the 90s, and you start to see how that culture change happens. And certainly there are designers involved in the way that you experience an electric car, both from the outside and from the in. So, yeah. Okay. I think any doubles can... Oh, we're here. Yeah.
Aside from actually prompting users for feedback, are there any strategies or techniques you come across for starting to quantify those very qualitative, subjective things like enjoyment?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can get into experience sampling, just offering someone a random question that's a one click, how are you feeling right now? Because at aggregate numbers, that data can be really interesting because for the user, all you see is how you feeling? Oh, I'm okay. And you keep going. But then at the aggregate, you can be based on the amount of time you spend on your site, the feeling goes down, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of one type of methodology. The other thing I think has to do with based on the interaction paradigm, whether it's a touch screen or whether it's the mouse or whatever, you can actually pick up some interesting factors of attention, what people are clicking on, what they're paying attention to, what they're noticing. And you can use that to sort of quantify whether attention is fragmented or whether we're focused, whether we need things out of the way. And this is something that people use to sell all the time. If you notice, you put stuff in your Amazon cart, and then if you say, I'm going to check out, all the navigation disappears. Because they're like, we just want you to go straight to buying now. We don't want you to get distracted by maybe buying something else. So what if we take that same principle and we apply it to something like well-being? It's like, oh, you've entered a chat with your friend. We're going to put everything out of the way so you can have an intimate conversation with your friend as opposed to multitask, so that you can strengthen that relationship. Or we're going to encourage video so you can have some facial cues, because we've seen that face-to-face interaction is sort of more beneficial for mental health than just sort of text. So things like that. Yeah. Cool.
So we may take the last question.
Last question.
Because, yeah, sorry.
You guys have to fight for it. Okay, over here.
So one thing with sort of mindfulness is sort of there's this kind of late 20th century secular notion of mindfulness, right? John Kabat-Zinn,
Yep.
mindfulness retrospect and stuff. And then there's sort of a variety of different ways of talking about mindfulness through history, other sort of traditional Buddhist stuff. And it seems that in some of those, I would say that certain kinds of social institutions might be important. Other sorts of kind of social questions enter into concern about both what mindfulness is, or how you want to consider mindfulness, but also sort of, that these are sort of wisdom projects in some sort of sense.
Mhm.
Right? And I was wondering what your thought is on, not to say that the kind of current social institutions were sort of doing this mindfulness, modern mindfulness thing are the wrong sorts of ones, but what that sort of looks like to you, right? Because it seems like there's a certain way of framing this kind of modern mindfulness mental health individual level thing, which is not even downplaying, but does not have present sort of considerations for either it being sort of a larger sort of part of being wise, or also how it fits into society, what sort of social institutions are supporting it.
Lovely. Yeah.
And stuff like that.
Thank you for that question. So that's a very, very important question. It's going to take another hour, so I don't know. But I hope you come to our mindfulness conference, because that's exactly what we sort of discussed. But the short version is, so first of all, people associate mindfulness with Buddhism as its sort of origin. But actually, I believe in, and I think there's some solid evidence that many, many human cultural traditions have had some practice of sort of silent contemplation or attention, including prayer, but also like Kabbalah and Sufism. And there's so in some ways it's kind of a human tradition that there have been parts of almost every cultural and society tradition have decided maybe if we sort of close our eyes and investigate our conscious awareness, something interesting will come from that. And when it comes to looking at this modern thing, and certainly MBSR is like a modern incarnation, but technology is even more, and that kind of criticism is definitely valid for technologies that are sort of appropriating these cultures in some ways and changing them to a different perspective.
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
I'm okay with, I'm working on, feedback and
Oh,
BCI.
of course.
I'm okay with, having something new and,
Yeah, and so am I, but I'm also very sensitive to that level of appropriation, which is why at our conference, for example, we have people who work with the Dalai Lama, like his principal translator, and monks, as well as scientists talking to each other. And so I don't think there's a clear answer about this, but the Dalai Lama has been very supportive of science, so from a Buddhist tradition, and certainly there's going to be different people that have different opinions about this kind of stuff, but science is also a human cultural tradition. I mean, sure, we like to step aside and say we are hyperlogical and rational and these are all the answers, but it's also a human cultural tradition, and I think MBSR and the modern mindfulness movement is really just a new cultural tradition embracing, again, the value of subjective experience, of paying attention in the present moment, of being sort of compassionate to oneself and non-judgment. So that's my take on it, but it's turtles all the way down. There's a lot we can talk about, so maybe afterwards. Cool. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.